Well, joining us now, somebody who's worked very closely with Jaswant Singh for several decades, a personal friend of his, a former colleague, Yashwant Sinha, the former finance minister. Thanks very much, sir, for being with us. It's such a sad day for so many people across the country. We'll talk about Jaswant Singh's legacy, but he was also your friend. Tell us a little bit about the person that Jaswant Singh was.
Well, before I tell you about the person that Jaswant Singh was, let me tell you that because our names were common, just spelled differently. So there has often been very many confusions with regard to our presence here or there. Even this morning, many people thought that I had passed away. And they called friends, common friends, to find out what exactly had happened to me, until it was clarified that no, indeed, it was Jaswant Singh. Jaswant Singh ji has been a friend of mine from before I joined the BJP. He was, as you know, a leading light of the Bharatiya Janata Party. I remember when I joined the Bharatiya Janata Party in 1993, there were 4 people only who used to sit on the dais of the Bharatiya Janata Party. One was Mr. Vajpayee, the second was Mr. Advani, the third was Rajmata ji of Gwalior, and the fourth was Jaswant Singh. That was his position in the party. And in the government, which Mr. Vajpayee formed in 1998, which continued until 2004, he was the leading light of the cabinet, not merely a member of the Cabinet Committee on Security, but one of the closest advisors of Vajpayee ji, the Prime Minister. So he played a very, very important role, both in party affairs as well as in the government. He was kind of a troubleshooter for Mr. Vajpayee. And I remember many occasions where Mr. Vajpayee asked him to solve a problem which appeared to be insoluble, but was quickly resolved by Jaswant Singh. He was a great foreign policy expert, a great strategic expert, a soldier, politician, administrator, and a scholar. So he was a remarkable breed in politics. There are not many. Even in his time, there were not many who could match him. Today, we are much poorer because he is not in our place.
And would you say, sir, that his most lasting legacy as a minister was in reaching out to the United States and building on that strategic equation? Not building on it, I would say really taking it to a new level. It was never really very significant before he was External Affairs Minister. Would you say that that is, in a sense, his defining moment as a minister?
When the nuclear tests took place in May 1998, then you are aware that most of the most powerful countries in the world took a dim view of India going for nuclear tests. The leading nation which did not approve of our action was the US. Jaswant Singh was not the minister then. He was deputy chairperson of the Planning Commission. But Atalji, who was handling the External Affairs Ministry directly at that time, decided to give the responsibility for explaining India's case to the world to Jaswant Singh. And because of his vast knowledge of his strategy and foreign policy, it was not a difficult task for Jaswant Singh to go around and meet representatives of various countries and explain India's position. He dealt with a Strobe Talbot from the US.
Yes.
They set the basis for improved relations with the US, which culminated in the visit of President Clinton to India in the year 2000. So within a very short period of time, he was able to convince the US administration about the real need for India to go nuclear. And the US was convinced. And that was the beginning not only of an understanding with the US on the nuclear front, it was also the beginning of a much deeper relationship between India and the US, which had been, both democracies, the largest in the world, and they had a troubled relationship
Right.
early.
But sir, tell me also about another part of his life, and that of course was Kandahar and what happened over there. It was a difficult moment for all of us in this country, sort of seen to back terrorists, but he didn't have very much of a choice. Could you run us through some of the decisions which he was a part of?
Well, when the Indian Airlines plane was hijacked and taken ultimately to Afghanistan, which was under the rule of Taliban at that point of time, and we did not have any relationship with them. Secret negotiations were held with Taliban. The matter used to be discussed in the Cabinet Committee on Security, I remember. And, in retrospect, we might blame the NDA government or Jaswant Singh ji, because he traveled personally to Kandahar. But things were so uncertain at that point of time that nobody really knew what will happen, even when we thought that we had reached an agreement with the Taliban. And the presence of a senior minister of the government who had the courage to travel to Kandahar and face all kinds of dangers and uncertainties, that was a role that Jaswant Singh played at that time.
Yeah.
And let me remind you that if something had gone wrong, we would have had a very senior member of the government who enjoyed the confidence of the Prime Minister to take decisions on the spot. Now, he was much criticized, reviled for the fact that he traveled with the terrorists to Kandahar. But I think from the point of view of those days, when we were facing an extremely difficult situation and so many lives were at stake, Jaswant Singh ji played a stellar role, and his travel to Kandahar was fully warranted.
Yeah, he also had a huge role in developing India as a nuclear power, as a military nuclear power. Again, there would be difficult choices which he made. There would be international policies which he'd have to be very closely aware of. As you mentioned, negotiating with the United States, other international powers, and yet keeping our national security concerns, very much at the forefront. So as somebody who helped build up India's nuclear capabilities and endorsed that process, what role did he have?
Well, he played a very important role in this. You know that after the nuclear tests, India came out with a nuclear doctrine. And I remember very well that Jaswant Singh ji had a very important role to play in drafting that nuclear doctrine, which was ultimately adopted by the Cabinet Committee on Security and became India's policy on nuclear issues. He laid the foundation for understanding with the US on the nuclear issue. And in a way, I would say that ultimately, the fact that the world accepted India as a nuclear weapons state, the foundations for that were laid by Jaswant Singh ji. He worked very hard. And as I mentioned to you earlier, his understanding of strategic issues, global strategic issues, was so tremendous that this is something which would have impressed any interlocutor who came across him. And it was his vast knowledge of strategic affairs which he brought to bear on all issues, including the nuclear deal. In fact, let me tell you today that I felt extremely inadequate in succeeding him in the External Affairs Ministry, because there was no way in which I could match his scholarship and his understanding of of all issues concerning policy.
So one more a quick question before we let you go. He was a very intense man. He was formidable, you know, and he was intimidating. As a young journalist, I was intimidated by Jaswant Singh, as at the time most journalists probably would have been. But he also had a sense of humor, which he would occasionally let slip. And he would often say things with a straight face. And coming from that intense personality, that he would often not expect it at all.
No, you're quite right. I mean, he had a tremendous sense of humor. I remember, you know, the very fact that he used to have his prescribed quota of drinks every evening. He didn't conceal this from anyone. And once in Lok Sabha, I remember, he said about some concession which had been given by the government in some tax or the other. He said that this is not enough to even buy him a bottle of whiskey. Now, that represented not only his sense of humor, but also the candor which was there in the person. And he was quite frank about it, didn't conceal anything. Very strict, you know. Even when we used to visit him as colleagues, I remember that he will look at his watch, and that will be the end of the evening conversation, because he wanted to follow his strict routine. Oftentimes, he would miss dinners, official dinners at Rashtrapati Bhavan, because the timing would not suit him, or he would find that he would have to miss his couple of drinks that he used to have every evening.
Right.
So he was a formidable personality, no doubt. You know, redoubtable, a soldier to the end of his life, a scholar of great achievement, and an administrator par excellence.
Right, right. Sir, thank you so much, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, for speaking to us in your memories, some of them on Jaswant Singh. Thank you very much, sir, indeed.